Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. In this video, I want to talk about the golden calf narrative in the book of Exodus. We're going to focus primarily on Exodus 32, 7 to 14, but I will give some framing elements to put it into its context within the book so that you can go a little deeper into what's really happening in this particular passage. I encourage you to follow along in your scriptures so you can make sure that I'm staying along with the scriptures and that you can follow where I'm trying to drill down in. And so the first thing we want to talk about is when you read the golden calf story, it's important to see it within the flow. And I got this language from Terence Fredheim, who has a great commentary on the book of Exodus. He calls this the fall of Israel, right? We know what the fall of humanity happens back in Genesis chapter 3 with this Adam, Eve, serpent narrative where they eat from the tree of the garden, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the same kind of thing happens right here because the context of the golden calf story is the Ten Commandments have been given. The Ten Commandments in Exodus were spoken from Sinai, and all the people heard God speaking them. The Ten Commandments are in Exodus chapter 20. You can go back and look at verses essentially 1 to 17 of Exodus. And so that's the context. And the opening commandments are pretty clear. And I'm going to include what many of us would call the prologue. Again, there's different ways of ordering the Ten Commandments. But listen to verse 2. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that's in heaven above or on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. So just notice that the Ten Commandments open with a series of teachings that essentially, if we were going to summarize it in Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, will summarize these opening commandments essentially as love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your very much. The opposite of loving God isn't hating God, it's idolatry and syncretism, right? And so those opening commandments, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You will have no other gods before me. You will not make images of other gods. And so when Israel makes a golden calf, and the story of the making of the golden calf is the beginning of chapter 32, the first 6 verses. They are essentially in violation of the initial commandments that God gave Israel at Sinai, in the same way that the only command that God gave Adam and Eve was not to eat fruit from one tree, and they broke that. So this is a story of the fall of Israel. And it's really interesting, those first 6 verses give us some framing. This people come to Aaron and specifically ask him to make gods who will go before us. For this Moses, and listen to the language, this is 32 verse 1. Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. So notice, they've already broken that opening statement. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. No, it wasn't the Lord, it was Moses. Moreover, Aaron asked the folks for gold, and this is ironic. How did Israel get gold? How do any of the people have gold? Well, if you go back in the book of Exodus, before they left, the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed to the Israelites as they were leaving and give them all the gold. So in a sense, this was an offering to God's people because of what God had done for God's people. And now the Israelites are taking that and making an idol. Moreover, now Aaron proclaims, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So this story is about idolatry and syncretism, and there's just a lot of irony here because the people had literally just heard God speak these words, and Moses had already been up the hill, come back down, and now Moses is simply going back up to Sinai to receive more instructions from Yahweh, because the people, if you go back to chapter 20, verses 18 to 22, they were afraid to hear God speaking anymore and requested that Moses be their mediator. So the mediator is now going back up the mountain, and in his absence, the people turn away from the one who really brought them out of Egypt. Now, what else is going on here? There's a critique that's taking place in the book. And this is a critique of what's known as the Aaronite priesthood. We know from the Old Testament that the Levites will be the priestly class, and we also know from the Pentateuch that it's Aaron and Aaron's sons who will be essentially the high priests. And this is a critique of religious leadership from the very beginning, because what's the role of religious leadership? It's to follow Yahweh's commandments, teach them to the people, and practice, administer the actual cult that worships the Lord, and to worship God in the way that God prescribes. And so the very person who should have known better is the one who actually makes the calf for the people. Now, the criticism is even a little stronger when you realize that Exodus 32, verse 4, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt," is exactly the same language that we're going to see later in Israel's scriptures. If you want to flip ahead, this shows up in 1 Kings, and in the story of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who built 2 golden calves. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, if you may recall, was the person who, under the authority of Yahweh, established the northern kingdom because of the recklessness of Solomon's son Rehoboam. And Jeroboam was to actually lead the northern kingdom to practice faithfulness, but instead, what does he do? If you remember, Jeroboam creates 2 golden calves, so there's 2 in this context. And when he creates them, listen to the language. This is 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 28. "So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, 'You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" And so, Exodus 32:6, 1 Kings 12:28, all basically identical. And so they're to be read together as a critique. So the sin that Jeroboam leads Israel into has its roots at Sinai, but the way the Sinai sin is written up in the Pentateuch, it sounds a lot like what Jeroboam does. So there's just kind of this circular back and forth thing. And again, we're not going to get into the weeds, but it's one of those chicken or the egg things, or is there even a deeper tradition behind both of these? But it's clear that we're supposed to associate Moses' sins with Aaron's sins with Jeroboam's, and Jeroboam's sins with Aaron's. So this is ultimately a critique of the failure of spiritual leadership. In this case in particular, the failure of the Aaronite priesthood, which again, ironically, hasn't even fully been established in Exodus. We're going to see that in Leviticus, right? But the roots of the critique are already here. Now, what we do see is Moses as a spiritual leader. And when you read 32, and now I'm going to specifically make some comments on 32:7 to 14, there's a massive problem. God is speaking to Moses, and God is upset because God knows what is happening down in the valley below. And he informs Moses that the people have quickly turned aside. And when you read verses 7 and 8, Israel's acted perversely. They've been quick to turn aside from what I've commanded. They've made themselves the image of a calf. They've worshipped it. They've sacrificed to it. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I've seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make you a great nation. So God literally is telling Moses of Israel's apostasy and informing Moses that Yahweh is about to do a redo. And you probably picked up that language. What is Yahweh promising Moses? I'm going to make you into a great nation. So there's the offer that Moses can now be a new Abraham. God's going to literally start over. And so the story is going to literally kind of go back to Genesis 12 and start over all over again because of the stiff-necked nature of God's people. Now, it's interesting that God says, let me alone, as though God has to get permission from Moses to do what he's doing. And so most interpreters, and this goes way back to some of the earliest interpreters of these texts, notice that essentially God is giving a pause. It's not so much a test of Moses, but it's just to see what's in Moses, because God is giving Moses an opportunity to step up in contrast to Aaron. And what does Moses do? Verses 11 to 13, Moses models what true spiritual leadership looks like. Moses passionately advocates for the people and begins to pray to God. And Moses appeals essentially to God's character in those prayers. You can read verses 11 through 13. Moses appeals to God to remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if those of you who've read the book of Exodus all the way through know there's a place in Exodus where it says that God remembers. That's back in chapter 2. And that was the start of the deliverance. If you go back to chapter 2, the text says, verse 24, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you go back to Genesis 8:1, God remembered Noah. So when you see remember language in the Old Testament narrative, that isn't like God forgot something. It's actually an exclamation that God is present, willing, ready, able to get after it right now. So Moses is actually appealing to God in the same way that God remembered in chapter 2 and initiated the deliverance. Moses is essentially praying to God to be God, the God that he knows, the God that called him, the God that's delivered Israel. And then, friends, what kind of God is that? It's so critical. I'm going to come back to Moses' spiritual leader, but essentially Moses' appeal, and it's not like Moses is convincing God of anything, but Moses is proclaiming the truth that God is going to be God. And that's the question, what's God really like? And you know what God's really like? And this is really important. In the midst of this really difficult narrative, the golden calf story, where Israel's future is at stake, we see definitively that we get a description of what God is like on the inside. What is God's internal, not eternal, internal character like? God's internal character is a steadfast love. This is that Hebrew word chesed. You spell it this way in English. It's like a hard H sound. God's internal character at the center of that is love. So we don't need the New Testament to tell us that God is love. It's right here. And this we see this most clearly at the end of this narrative in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, where we find out what kind of God really is. And let me just read those attributes that show up in chapter 34. I am the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That's who God is really like. And so what we really see in the golden calf, despite Israel's fall, is we see the heart of God's mission, or the heartbeat of God's mission, which is God's steadfast love, a love that's endlessly able to forgive and show mercy. So at this point in the narrative, it's like when Israel commits this sin, is Israel now going to be treated like the Egyptians? And we find out that God is a God of love, and God has loving compassion for Israel. And what we also see, to go back to this, just to build on Moses, if you read all the way through Exodus 32 through 34, there's a series of prayers that Moses does. Moses intercedes for Israel 4 times. The first one is here in 32:7 to 14. The second prayer that Moses gives is in chapter 32 in verse 31. The third prayer is in 33:12. And then the final prayer is 34:8 and the verses that follow in those places. And Moses intercedes and demonstrates. What is it at the core of a spiritual leader? He appeals essentially to God, but a spiritual leader never gives up on his people. And God was going to say, hey, you can be a great nation. But Moses came to be a servant. Moses, the servant of God. And Moses models for us what a true spiritual leader does with his people. He prays, he intercedes, he leads. And these are a few comments that I wanted to make about the golden calf narrative. If you have other questions, feel free to interact in the comments of this video. If you're in my Exodus class this semester, we have discussion forums where we can break these things down even more. It's an absolute privilege to serve you. Thank you for listening. Until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope to others.